Yeah, it's been a while, but I have a legitimate excuse this time. And that's the end of the excuse. So I think I'm onto something here, and it's about time I sat down to try to piece together, at this point, years worth of lore speculation and make a video. Because aside from being inspired by Joel Haver to make animations, it was the lore of this game that really made me want to make a YouTube channel in the first place. So enough with the yammering on about nothing. Here's my first lore speculation video. Hope you enjoy it. With the release of the Shadow of the Erdtree trailer, although I certainly have more questions now, some nebulous connections started to clear up and at least tentatively settled some aspects of the story and timeline for me. To illustrate what's tentatively settled for me, I think it's best to do three things first. First, I'll have to lay out a few beliefs I have about the game that are heavily speculative and or have a very long and complicated explanation of why I believe them that go outside of the purview of this video topic. Second, I'll have to give a brief overview of the framework by which I assess the meaning of items and dialogue within the game. And third, I'll have to cover some other aspects of the lore as a basis of how I got here. Some of which may seem disconnected as I'm going over them, but I'll have to ask you to trust that I'm going somewhere. So here are some things about the lore that I'm mostly settled on that I won't go much into here, although I may end up explaining them a bit later in the video. I believe that Melina's the Gloom-Eyed Queen. Not exactly an uncommon belief. There are numerous theories about this out there, so this doesn't need much explanation. I believe that Radagon was originally a part of Marika that split off and then returned. This much, it's hard to defend this. It's really just, it fits in afterwards when you see the rest of what my theory is. And then the game's lore is heavily inspired by both Western and Eastern ideas of alchemy, Greco-Roman theology and mythology, as well as Christian theology and imagery, Celtic. You get what I'm saying here. There's lots of this stuff and threads and videos out there of evidence of this stuff, so I'll only touch on it briefly. And as noted by the YouTuber Quelaag, I think that's how you say it, Miyazaki likes to take traditional Western ideas and turn them on their head. And I'll find the video where they explain this and leave the link in the description. So, here's the general framework for how I assess item descriptions and dialogue in the game. These two things are the main ways From Software is sharing the story with us. So the issues that arise from translating Japanese into English aside, I believe their goal is to make sure that putting all of these puzzle pieces together is a reasonable enough task for the player base to accomplish. I don't think they'd, at least very often, attempt to mislead the reader or listener without leaving obvious context clues in the phrasing that would alert them that the item description they are reading or the character they're talking to is attempting to do so. Taking into account that some characters may not have the full picture of the topic they're discussing and may be unreliable in that sense, I like to take what they say at face value. So this doesn't mean that I don't take into account phrasing that may imply they're lying or that they're sharing specific perspective they have. This just means when a character states something like a historical event as true, excluding the circumstances I just talked about, I take it as true. And I hope all that makes sense. Okay, on to the first section of this probably needlessly convoluted perspective. A quick note before we start this section, I'll leave a link to the Wikipedia page for the Philosopher's Stone in the description. Going over the alchemical themes in Elden Ring would take an entire video on its own, so check that out if you're unfamiliar with this connection before watching this section. This section, like much of this theory, is going to contain heavy speculation, so if you see certain things differently, just bear with me for a bit and see if as the video goes on, my interpretation starts to make more sense. Starting with the Radagon as Marika, I think that the state we find them in at the end of the game is not how they started. I actually think they began as a completely different individual that wasn't explicitly masculine or feminine, but a fusion of both. Briefly touching on the alchemical themes I mentioned, I think they were originally the perfect union of the White Queen and the Red King called the Rebus, which of course isn't an uncommon view at this point. I'll leave a link to a video covering this in the description. So here's some of that heavy speculation, but I think that sometime shortly before or at the start of the Golden Order, Radagon is split off of whatever Marika used to be. This splits the White Queen from the Red King, and one thing that leads me towards this theory is that before her era, it was the era of the Crucible, an era where life seemed to be a chaotic mix of many things. If Marika was born after the Newman arrived in the Lands Between, it's possible that perhaps through one of her parents, that her original form was just as chaotic as life generally was during the Crucible era. In essence, before the split happens, I think there was a being that represented the true finished product of the Philosopher's Stone, if you will, with Marika and Radagon being the Rebus, that was the perfect companion for a complete Elden Ring. Going back to the idea that Miyazaki likes to flip these ideas around, instead of them growing into the Philosopher's Stone or a representation of it, these characters devolved from one. And through splitting, it seems like Marika was trying to single out the aspect of herself that was pure, and to her, this was the ideal of order. You can see this in the way that she seems to view things outside of her ideal that permeate throughout the descriptions concerning Omen, Misbegotten, eventually the Crucible, Serpents, and so on. She's crafted a world full of prejudice for anything and anyone that doesn't fit into her ideology. Now, concerning the incomplete fusion that we see in their final state, Mesmer has made something click in my mind. Because Radagon, for someone so dedicated to the Golden Order, has some interesting links to so many things considered blasphemous to that very same order. Misbegotten worship him, Leonine Misbegotten have his weapons and share his hair color, which of course links him to the Crucible. The letters of his name make up the Spanish word Dragona, which in English means female dragon. The red of his hair is mentioned to be a curse of the giant kind, implying either he's part giant or was cursed by them. And considering the framework of my theory so far, it would make sense that Marika, or whoever she was before Radagon originally split from her, would want to divest herself of these aspects of herself in pursuit of her ideal order. Because if they were once a completely unified being, that would mean that Marika herself was a perfect representation of the Crucible era. Chaotically mixed forms of life made up of so many different types of life, which is why it isn't surprising to me that she ends up having 2 Omen children. And if Mesmer is her 3rd child, I mean, look at this fool. Blasphemous. One thing that isn't explicitly linked to Radagon, or at least there aren't any links I'm currently aware of, are snakes or serpents. However, as the Christians out there or anyone familiar with Christian theology may have connected in their minds already, dragons and serpents can be synonymous in that context. Satan, or the accuser, is referred to as both a serpent and a dragon. There are other themes in Elden Ring, especially with the Shadow of the Erdtree trailer, which we'll get into later, that remind me of specifically Chapter 12 of Revelation. Perhaps some inspiration for the serpents and dragons in Elden Ring, there's Revelation chapter 12 verses 7 through 9. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent, who was called the devil and Satan. The deceiver of the whole world, he was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And then at the beginning of chapter 12, perhaps this is concerning the Gloom-Eyed Queen, Queen Renala, Omen in their horns, and then the Radagon dragon thing. A great omen appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs, in the agony of giving birth. Then another omen appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on its heads. In the immortal words of Chael Sonnen, I say that to say this. I think the Marika that we see at the end of the game, the supposed queen and ruler of the lands between, is in fact a false sovereign, and is actually the deceiving and blasphemous serpent. When we look at the Shadow of the Erdtree trailer, there's something resembling a veil over the land of shadow, and many have already connected this both to the baldachin in Marika's chamber, as well as the item that mimics veil, also known as Marika's mischief. This is one of the things that connected the dots that inspired me to make this video, and it gives me the impression that the obscuring of the land of shadow that the illusory Erdtree is doing, as stated in the Shadow of the Erdtree section on the Elden Ring website, is Marika's doing. And to further the case of Marika being a deceiver, we can also look at the Radagon as Marika situation. Not only was this secret kept from nearly everyone in the lands between, but her other half, Radagon, was married to Renala, who was at one point her enemy. And as I understand it, it was this marriage that ended, or at least heavily contributed to the ending of the invasion of Liurnia. There's much more that goes into making the case for this, but first I'll need to talk about the 2-headed serpent imagery that's within Elden Ring. At this point, I'm sure some of you are wondering, where is he going with this? So am I. Just kidding. This theory requires like an excessive amount of other lore interpretation from my perspective to make sense, so please bear with me. Throughout the lands between and within the Shadow of the Erdtree trailer, imagery of intertwining 2-headed serpents seems to be everywhere. You find one in the depraved perfumer's robe, of which the embroidery, which is the 2-headed intertwining snake, is mentioned in its item description, robe worn by depraved perfumers. The embroidery on the apron is itself a curse upon the Erdtree. You find Placidusax in a stasis with his 2 remaining heads intertwined. You find it in the Shadow of the Erdtree trailer as Mesmer is joined with the 2-headed snake. You can see it on the Shadow of the Erdtree Collector's Edition box. But one peculiar place you'll find it is wrapped around the shoulders and stomach of the abductor virgins. Now, finding something covered in snakes in the Volcano Manor might not be a surprise, but something curious is that you find one very close to a Godskin apostle. I'm sure someone has mentioned this somewhere before, but the abductive version has some striking similarities to the Gloom-Eyed Queen in a few ways. For one, she carries with her a baby, swaddled in cloth. When she opens her abdomen, the doors, as you may have noticed, are covered in flesh. But if you look closely at the doors of the chamber, it's not just a random assortment of flesh, it's skin. And who do we know of that is known to swaddle babies in skin? You'll see what I'm getting at here. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, a Godskin apostle fight is right next to one of these contraptions, making this, in my opinion, more than a coincidence. Now, looking closer at the snakes, at least to me, these snakes don't seem to be something she's adorning willfully. And to me, they look as though they've wrapped themselves around her and are controlling her. Something I think that strengthens this observation are the 4 ball and chains that are also hanging off of her. But with that, it's time to get into the meat of the heavy speculation in this theory. As I stated earlier, and this is also a commonly thought thing amongst the Elden Ring community, I am of the opinion that Melina is also the Gloom-Eyed Queen. I won't go into why here, maybe I'll do so in a separate video, but for now, it's just important to know that's where I stand with her identity. Plus, there are already a bunch of great videos out there already talking about this theory, so I don't want to rehash that here. So, moving on, I think the implication of this theory means 2 things. One, that if Melina is the Gloom-Eyed Queen, then she predates the existence of the Golden Order. 2, that Melina, again, if she's the Gloom-Eyed Queen, is most likely not Marika's daughter. Or at least not the Marika we see at the end of the game. We know that the Gloom-Eyed Queen's defeat by Malekith and the subsequent sealing of Destined Death kicks off the start of the Golden Order. Therefore, if Melina is the Gloom-Eyed Queen, she predates the Golden Order. Marika, as far as we know, doesn't have a consort until after the Golden Order began, so the timeline doesn't line up for her to be one of Godfrey or Radagon's children. Now, some of you may be thinking, what about her saying she was born at the base of the Erdtree, or that her mother is in the Erdtree, or that her internal name in the game files is Marika of Daughter, or she's able to listen to echoes of Marika? Well, hold on. Considering the timeline I just presented, let's list some things we know about the Gloom-Eyed Queen, as well as new information from Miyazaki's recent interviews and the Shadow of the Erdtree trailer. She was an Empyrean, she had Destined Death in her possession, she created the Godskin Apostles by swaddling babies in the skin of gods, she was defeated by Malekith, and the Rune of Death was subsequently sealed. The sealing of the Rune of Death caused the flames of the Godskin Apostles to be weakened. There's a weapon referred to as sacred that the Godskin Apostles channeled their flames from. If she was around before the Golden Order, then that means there were gods around before the Golden Order that she killed for their skins. And she was called Queen. Now here is some admittedly heavy speculation, but from this, I believe that the Gloom-Eyed Queen wasn't in competition with Marika for the title of God when she was defeated by Malekith. I think that she was already the god. Let me explain. Finger Reader Enya describes Marika as the vessel of the Elden Ring and carrier of its vision. This means, in a sense, it has become a part of her and her a part of the Elden Ring, allowing her to utilize its power to exert her version of order. We can see evidence of this when her body shatters after she shatters the Elden Ring. But when did this fusion happen? Well, we know that the sealing of the Rune of Death started her reign beginning with the establishment of the Golden Order. Finger Reader Enya states, "The Rune of Death goes by 2 names. The other is Destined Death, the Forbidden Shadow, plucked from the Golden Order upon its creation." We know the Gloom-Eyed Queen wielded the power of Destined Death right up until the literal start of the Golden Order. And, as I think this is a common interpretation of Enya's words and other sources in the game, the Rune of Death was plucked from the Elden Ring upon the creation of the Golden Order. If that's the case, then that seems to suggest that the Elden Ring was whole until Marika removed the Rune of Death from it. But hold on, we know that the Rune of Death is in use by the Gloom-Eyed Queen until she's defeated. You're probably already seeing where I'm going with this, but if the Gloom-Eyed Queen was an Empyrean capable of being a vessel for the Elden Ring, and she was actively using the Rune of Death, which was still within the Elden Ring, this means, to me, she was already the vessel for the Elden Ring. That's why she was the Gloom-Eyed Queen. Now, I know it's also a common theory that she was channeling Destined Death from the Godslayer Greatsword, but let's take a closer look at the weapon and its item description. Sacred Sword of the Gloom-Eyed Queen, who controlled the Godskin Apostles before her defeat at the hands of Malekith. The black flames wielded by the Apostles are channeled from this sword. The way I read this means the channeling is not attributed to her in this description, but specifically the Godskin apostles. In fact, the weapon's skill is called the Queen's Black Flame, implying that the Black Flame belongs to her. Now, I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that because Black Flames can be channeled from the blade, that she herself did the same. But, as I stated before, Destined Death wasn't sealed until after her defeat, implying that it was in her possession until then. Additionally, once it was sealed, the Black Flames from the sword as well as the Black Flames generated by the Godskin apostles are weakened, losing their ability to kill gods. The description of the Scouring Black Flame incantation states the following. The Black Flame could once slay gods, but when Malekith sealed Destined Death, the true power of the Black Flame was lost. This implies that her use of Destined Death is what gave these Black Flames the power to kill gods. So what follows from this interpretation is that she had already won the right to rule. Now, it could be that Marika was selected as an Empyrean shortly after the Gloom-Eyed Queen's era began, just like Melina, Mikola, and Ranni were already Empyrean long before the Shattering happened, which implies that the Greater Will had chosen them before Marika had taken any action against the Greater Will. But another possibility is that she was selected as an Empyrean along with the Gloom-Eyed Queen, and possibly others. Personally, I lean towards the latter. Not only that, but something that links the Empyrean of the current era with each other is they are all siblings. And I think it's plausible that Melina is Marika's sibling. But the sibling speculation isn't all that necessary to the theory I'm proposing. What is the nature of how the Empyrean Marika supplanted the Empyrean Gloom-Eyed Queen with her golden era. The golden era is represented well by Marika's golden tree. However, I don't think her golden tree is the Erdtree. In fact, I don't think that the tree dripping sap in the shadow of the Erdtree trailer is her tree either. I think that's the real Erdtree. But it doesn't belong to her. You see, I think her tree is the tree wrapped around the dripping tree, pulling it down so that the sap drips into the bowl in that building, evoking that twisting two-headed snake imagery once more. Shortly after the Shadow of the Erdtree trailer dropped, there were a bunch of interviews that Miyazaki did. The translations are many, and some of them can completely change the meaning, but one thing that stood out is that he referred to the Erdtree in the title as the golden tree we see in the base game. Now, some have interpreted this to mean that the Erdtree is synonymous with golden tree, but I disagree with this interpretation. It seems to me he meant that in the context of the title, Erdtree is specifically referring to the golden tree we see in the base game. Well, as I believe was shown by Tarnished Archaeologist in a video they made, the golden tree we see in the game is not what the Erdtree actually looks like, and that the actual tree has very likely been burned before. This is possibly hinted at in the item description of Bernthal's armor. The golden tree shining throughout the lands between is an illusion cast over the real Erdtree, and you can see some obvious evidence of this at the entrance. You can see that wooden bark is surrounding the entrance, and there is a bit of a slit that extends a ways above the door showing more of that bark. Another theory that I believe is also from Tarnished Archaeologist, but I could be misremembering, is that the Crucible, the primordial Erdtree, was made up of many competing aspects and roots of trees, and that the Erdtree won out. This is where I believe Marika's real tree comes from. You see, we never really see the base of the Erdtree in game, and even for those who are able to clip outside of the map, you're still not able to get to the base of the tree. So here comes some more heavy speculation. I think the Erdtree is still technically the Gloom-Eyed Queen's tree to rule in, and that Marika, rather than succeeding the Gloom-Eyed Queen, is actually unjustly ruling in her stead. And I think we're going to see the base of the Erdtree in the Land of the Shadow. We know that when we see the representations of the thrones before we fight Morgott, we're seeing the representations of thrones that are situated at the base of the Erdtree. And what do we see when Mesmer is revealed in the trailer? The real version of that very same throne. This might be the section with the heaviest speculation in this entire video, but here we go. I think that the association with death and the Gloom-Eyed Queen is a red herring. I know this seems out of left field, but let's go back to Melina and her moveset for a bit. When we see her fight, she utilizes a dagger that's reminiscent of the daggers the Black Knife assassins use, but instead she uses golden energy to fight. This connects her to the Newman, but in a very unique way. As this theory is partially hinged upon Melina being the Gloom-Eyed Queen, then her using gold as a weapon seems so unlike the queen that's been described through item descriptions and dialogue. Something to keep in mind is that death is taboo in Marika's era. So it would make sense that all that is recorded of her in the history of the Lands Between is her association with destined death. But as I suggested earlier, she had possession of the entire Elden Ring, And even though I don't believe the Greater Will cares much about the particular expression of an era of order, there does seem to be some association with gold and the Greater Will. The Elden Ring itself is a golden color. The sap dripping from what I suggested is the real Erdtree is a golden color. The Elden Beast has gold within it, as well as a golden Erdtree-like tail when viewed in its entirety. However, something that stands out in particular about the Elden Beast's appearance is that shadowy blackness that surrounds its form. When the Elden Ring is complete, death seems to just be another aspect of its power. So what about her being born at the base of the Erdtree and her mother being inside the Erdtree? Well, there are two theories that stand out to me in the framework of how I view the lore of this game, and regarding the first, something that's been pointed out in quite a few Reddit posts and lore videos is that the Newman race and the Knox are likely one and the same. Not only that, but their society is matriarchal. You'll have to trust me on that one as it would take way too long to explain why that may be the case. But with that being said, I believe the Erdtree had already sprouted from the Crucible long before the Gloom-Eyed Queen and Marika's reigns. Why? Again, the awesome YouTuber Tarnished Archaeologist has convinced me with their videos that the era of the dragons and beastmen would be considered ancient in comparison to Marika's era. Now, I do think both the Gloom-Eyed Queen and Marika were around for the sprouting, and that once Marika supplanted the Gloom-Eyed Queen, the Erdtree became the predominant theology of the lands between, if you will. Meaning, no longer is this the Crucible era, even if people were hanging on to that as they saw the Erdtree sprout, but now it's officially the era of the Erdtree. Now, I love the lore of the Newman and the Knox, so perhaps I'll go deeper on that in another video if people enjoy this one, but I've come to believe that there was possibly multiple cycles of a new ruler and civilization taking over abruptly and reordering the world during the Crucible era, and then probably during that brief period before the Erdtree had fully grown both literally and theologically. I think the last civilization to do so was probably the Newman civilization just before Marika took her reign. And to dump even further heavy speculation on this section, I think it's possible that the mother of the Gloom-Eyed Queen and Marika was the god preceding the Gloom-Eyed Queen. I'm not particularly in favor of this theory, it's just something that makes sense to me in the framework of how I see the lore of the game. It's the next theory that I think is more likely. And that one is that Melina is, in a way, Marika's daughter, but not the Marika we see at the end of the game. Instead, it's the version of Marika I suggested may have existed before Radagon split from her, and perhaps a being that doesn't share the same name as Marika. What brought me to considering this theory as the most likely to me is that Melina throughout the game has ample opportunity to explicitly say Marika is her mother. And considering she tells us things that Marika says at different locations throughout the game, it's puzzling that she doesn't. Instead, she only refers to Marika as Queen Marika. And yet she does reference having a mother, but she chooses to refer to her mother as mother. Some may suggest that she does this because she doesn't want to reveal that Marika is her mother, but I think I strongly disagree with this perspective. By stating that her mother resides or resided within the Erdtree to our Tarnished, from a lore perspective, she'd be stating that to a person who learns that only one person exists within the Erdtree, Marika. If she wanted to keep that connection secret, why would she say something like that to a person whose worldview will now lead them to believe she's talking about Marika? To me, I think this may be a misdirection meant to throw us off the trail of Melina's true origin. And with that, we move on to the final section. Going back to the trailer, at 1 minute and 35 seconds, Mesmer appears, and my brain exploded. The first little bit of research I did connected me to the caduceus staff wielded by the Roman god Mercury, due to the imagery of two-headed snakes and wings. Then that led me to the Sumerian god, I'm gonna try it, Ningishzida? I don't know. That seems to be the earliest version of this myth. And the current consensus on the meaning of this name, I'm gonna try it again, Ningishzida, is the Lord of the Good Tree. And I mean, that's like, what a coincidence. He seemed to be associated with both snakes and the underworld. Now, I stopped there with that line of research, but this is probably not a dead end, but I'll leave that out for another day. Mesmer is probably the biggest reason I was inspired to make this video. He's the reason I think Marika's original unsplit form wasn't just a Newman, but probably also a combination of many things considered by the Golden Order to be blasphemous. If it wasn't obvious with him asking his mother why she would lordship sanction someone, behind him is a statue of a woman that seems to be wearing the same clothes we typically see Marika in, holding a baby. Although some of these translations are suspect, in one of Miyazaki's interviews, he seems to outright say that he's a child of Marika. However, something that I'm sure people are talking about, but isn't something I've seen in discussions so far, is that his flame starts off in his hand pitch black, just like the red and black flames of the Rune of Death. So, in summary, Mesmer is adorned with and displays everything considered blasphemous by the Golden Order, maybe minus omen horns. His appearance has also been likened by many to be heavily inspired by Satan, or the deceiving red dragon and serpent that we talked about. He has an eye reminiscent of dragon eyes. He resides in an underworldly, shadowy place that displays a tree snaking around another tree and pulling it down to steal its sap and direct it into a bowl. Unlike Rykard, however, these things seem to be a part of who he is rather than something that was done to him after being eaten. And you're saying to me he's Marika's child. This is what triggered me to come to the conclusion that if she can birth a child like that guy, Marika's complete and original form was probably like that of, in the context of the Golden Order, a truly blasphemous and deceiving serpent, or a dragon, or probably both. And in the context of the Elden Ring universe, what could be more blasphemous than unjustly supplanting the chosen god of the greater will, and then once becoming the god herself, conspiring to kill both herself, the Elden Ring, and preventing the cycle of new orders of the greater will from continuing? Now, where did I get that last part from? Well, something that's bothered me about Gideon's betrayal and supposedly Marika wanting us to struggle eternally, and then Hugh's mission for Marika, is that at first, these two goals of Marika seem to contradict. How can she want no one to become Elden Lord while also tasking Hugh with creating a weapon that can kill a god? Well, there is something that happens at the end of the game that's convinced me they're both true, and they're both a part of her plan. After burning our way into the Erdtree, using the frenzied flame, of course, because I'm sure none of you are psychotic monsters who would burn Melina alive to get in here, right? Right? Okay. After entering the Erdtree, we're attacked by Radagon, a person that some people in the community believe tricked Gideon into thinking he was discovering the will of Marika, but instead was being manipulated by Radagon into keeping the Shattered Golden Order era in place. If this were true, then Radagon is directly resisting the will of the Greater Will. So, we kill him. Disobedience stopped. However, instead of the battle ending there, the Elden Ring itself turns Radagon into a weapon that's description hints that this is a punishment. And then, it attacks us. The very same person that stopped Radagon from preventing the next era of order from beginning. Doesn't the Greater Will want us to mend the Elden Ring and then become Elden Lord for a new order? Well, let's revisit Hugh. He is tasked with making for us a weapon that can kill Marika. Marika is the vessel of the Elden Ring, and the Elden Ring is also the Elden Beast, a vassal beast for the Greater Will sent to bring order to the lands between in its stead as a vassal. If we kill Marika, the Elden Ring, the very thing the Greater Will sent to bring order to the lands between in his stead, dies with her. You may have noticed that the Elden Beast seeps out of Radagon first, and when it forms itself, it retains a scar in the same place Marika was stabbed with that red spear. However, it's just as likely the scar could be from the Elden Ring when it's shattered. Both scenarios lead me to the same conclusion. Damage to her is damage to the Elden Beast, and vice versa. So, if we kill her, we kill it. Which is why it's no surprise that it separated itself from Radagon so that it could defend itself. If you need further proof of this interpretation, look at the words that appear when we kill the Elden Beast. God slain. Remember, we just killed Radagon, a being that's supposedly a part of a single god, and we saw nothing. Now, we killed the Elden Beast, and we're told we killed a god? Well, who's the god of the lands between? Marika. And we just killed her. And with her, the Elden Ring. We've been had. She's dead. The Elden Beast is dead. And therefore, the Elden Ring is dead. And we did it. Now, I know what you're thinking. Gideon says she doesn't want an Elden Lord, and you mend the Elden Ring with her and become Elden Lord in many of the endings. Correct. But, remember, the Elden Ring was already shattered, and the mending rune we brought with us was meant to repair it from the shattering, in a state where it was still alive. But, it's not anymore. Which means, we are now a consort to a dead god, a dead Elden Ring, and a dead incarnation of the ideals of the Greater Will. To me, this means we end the game in another false age, like the one we just ended. Now, ruling and struggling by our own ideals and decisions, without the influence of the Greater Will. Just like Marika planned. She deceived us. She deceived Gideon. And she even deceived her other self. And that's it. The end of this needlessly convoluted theory. Thanks for watching, and if you all like this one, maybe I'll make more lore videos like this in the future. Until then, peace.